Silent and fast they came in the night. A knife flashed under the moonlight, a hand pulled back hair, and in one quick motion the scalp was gone. Blood poured, bodies fell, scalps ripped away. A war cry cut through the night. This was a message. This land is ours. Scalping was war, power, and profit. Native warriors, settlers, bounty hunters, everyone took part. Governments paid for scalps, and killers didn't care if they come from warriors, women, or children. But where did scalping really begin? And who made money from it? And what happened to those few who survived? My name is Matthew, and this is Wild America. Now, to understand scalping on the frontier, you have to go back to before the first cowboy ever rode the range. Number 1, the bloody situation. Long before Europeans arrived, native warriors took scalps as trophies of victory. The practice went back thousands of years. War, religion, and vengeance all in one. For many tribes, hair wasn't just hair. It held power, identity, even the soul. Losing a scalp meant a lot more than defeat. It was total humiliation. Some were left alive, broken and shunned, seen as ghosts. The Mohawk understood the stakes. They shaved their heads, leaving a strip of hair, an open challenge. Young warriors were trained to fight and die well. They knew capture meant slow death by fire, blade, or torn flesh. Women and children joined the torture. It was all about breaking the enemy's will. Scalping, however, wasn't unique to North America. It was an ancient practice worldwide. But once Europeans arrived, it became business. Colonial governments paid for native scalps. Settlers soon copied the practice, and by the 1700s, both sides scalped. Sullivan's 1779 campaign recorded 104 scalps in one season. It became a trade, where life had a price and proof fit in your hand. Historians try to rewrite the past, claiming natives learned scalping from Europeans. Well, that's false. It had existed for millennia, a warrior's ritual, an evil reality. And on the frontier, it became one of the bloodiest currencies of all. For the few who survived, the nightmare didn't end with the knife. It was just beginning. Number 2, the treatment. Now, since surviving scalping often meant enduring the agony of a head ripped raw, one might ask, what happened to the victims who lived through it? You see, some died from infection or blood loss. Others endured unspeakable pain and somehow healed. And then there were the few who were patched up using a basic but shockingly effective surgical method that dates back centuries. That's right. Let's talk about trepanation, drilling holes into the skull. A French surgeon named Augustin Belloste pioneered the technique in 1696. His idea? If the skull was exposed, you could drill into it to trigger the growth of new flesh over the bone. It sounds barbaric, but it worked. So, instead of gaping wounds that never closed, survivors of scalping could regrow a tough, scarred covering over their heads. You'd be hairless, but you'd still be alive. Then, fast forward to the American frontier. Scalping was everywhere. By native warriors, by settlers, by bounty hunters. The lucky ones who survived had few options. Some doctors, likely aware of Belloste's methods, put it to use. The technique was rare, but evidence suggests it was tried at least 9 times on the frontier. A few men, stripped of their scalps, were treated by exposing the diplo, the spongy layer inside the skull, which triggered the body's healing response. Slowly, new tissue formed, sealing the skull like a natural skin graft. It was crude, it was painful, but in a world where a scalped man was expected to die, it was the closest thing to a second chance. Belloste's method still holds lessons for modern medicine. Today, surgeons performing complex skull surgeries sometimes use a version of the same technique to help wounds heal. Surviving scalping was rare, but soon, scalping became business. Number 3, the payback. What began as a symbol of savagery soon became survival, then cold, hard business. The first European to see a scalp was likely Jacques Cartier in the 1500s. He met Donnacona near present-day Quebec City. The meeting was friendly. dances, gifts, smiles, until Donnacona revealed his collection, 5 scalps stretched on wooden hoops. Europeans wrote of warriors stripping scalps, raising them high, unleashing the death cry, a chilling claim of victory. Scalps were paraded on spears, laughed over, even fed to dogs. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. The French, British, and Americans all saw it, then adopted it. Bounties followed, first on native scalps, then enemy scalps, then on anyone in the way. Cartier's record of that first encounter is strangely quiet. No horror, no reaction, just a simple note. After seeing these things, we return to our ships. But history tells the rest of the story. When colonial governments put bounties on scalps, they first required whole heads as proof, but scalps were lighter, easier to count. It began in 1637. Connecticut paid the Mohegans and Pequot scalps during the Pequot War. The Dutch followed in 1641, offering bounties for Raritan scalps. By 1643, the Iroquois were scalping French traders near Montreal. By the late 1600s, scalp bounties were everywhere. In 1675, New England paid settlers and native allies for enemy scalps during King Philip's War. And by 1692, even New France paid their native warriors for scalps. Then came Hannah Dustin, captured by the Abenaki in 1697. She killed 10 captors in the night, scalped them, and claimed a bounty. The law had been repealed 6 months earlier, but she was paid anyway. Scalp hunting surged during the colonial wars. By 1689, Massachusetts had its first bounty. In 1703, they raised the stakes during Queen Anne's War. By 1722, they paid £100 for an adult male scalp, $50 for a woman or child. Some men made scalping their full-time job. Not settlers, not soldiers, just mercenaries paid in human skin. Ranger John Lovewell became infamous for his scalp hunting raids, especially at Pequawket. Each scalp earned him £100, a fortune. His vile efficiency made him a colonial celebrity. At one point, Lovewell even made a wig out of his scalps, stitched together from the heads of the men he'd murdered. Then he marched through the streets of Boston, parading his gruesome prize like a trophy. But scalping made him cocky. He gathered 47 men and marched on a native village of over 100 people, looking to maximize his profits. It was a mistake. Lovewell was killed in the fight and fittingly scalped himself. Meanwhile, the French did the same. New France fought the Natchez and Meskwaki in the early 1700s, both sides scalping each other. By 1746, Massachusetts Governor William Shirley paid friendly natives for enemy scalps, £40 for a man, $20 for a woman or child. New York followed in 1747 with its own Scalp Act. Nova Scotia joined in. The bounty stayed until the Halifax Treaty ended the war. During the French and Indian War, Shirley kept paying, £40 for a man, $20 for a woman or child. Pennsylvania's Robert Morris raised the stakes in 1756, 130 pieces of 8 for Lenape male scalps, 50 for women's. Scalping became both policy and desperation. Frontier combat was brutal. Flintlocks reloaded too slowly, so knives, hatchets, and bows dominated. Governments raised payouts when participation lagged. Too little money, and no one risked their lives. And by the late 1700s, the practice faded. Not because scalping stopped, but because the frontier moved. New wars, new enemies. For over a century, human life was measured in the weight of a single scalp. Yet during the American Revolution, the British joined in. Henry Hamilton, the hair-buyer general, paid native warriors for American scalps. He armed them with scalping knives, rewarding by the head, excluding women and children. In one instance, he received 129 American scalps in a single day. But scalping bred more scalping. Enraged Americans retaliated, scalping British mercenaries in turn. Violence fed itself, scalp for scalp. Years later, in 1851, U.S. soldiers displayed native scalps in Stanislaus County, California. That same year, they and settlers launched the Tehama Massacre, slaughtering and scalping native men, women, and children. Yana, Yonkow, Nissinen, Wintu, Nomlaki, Patwin, Yuki, Maidu, no one was spared. By 1867, scalp bounties resurfaced. A Colorado town raised $5,000, offering $25,000 per scalp, ears included. Age and gender didn't matter. The U.S. government sanctioned it, just as it had for over a century. Some states like Arizona made it law. Scalping became a system of extermination. Women, children, even infants. For some historians, this was America's twist on an ancient practice, turning it into a state-sponsored killing machine. And for some, scalping was about money. For others, it was just bloodlust. Number 4. Kentucky gone savage. By the War of 1812, some Americans had fully adopted the practice of scalping, not for money, not for survival, but for the sheer brutality of it. One militia group from Kentucky, however, took it to another level. Before battle, they stripped to their underwear, smeared themselves in red wall paint, and went hunting. They scalped their enemies, not as trophies for cash, but as souvenirs of slaughter. One officer from Pennsylvania witnessed it firsthand. He sat next to a Kentuckian who, without hesitation, tore open his waistband, fleshed out the scalps with his knife, salted them, and stretched them in hoops. It was indeed a grisly process, done without shame. Most of the country was disgusted. The British, eager to paint Americans as uncivilized, spread the story far and wide. They called the Kentuckians the most barbarous, illiterate beings in America. But the men from Kentucky didn't shy away from the practice. One young soldier even mailed a scalp home to his parents. His parents' response? Daddy and Mama thought I had done about right. The violence wasn't entirely rumor. During the Battle of Maguaga on August 9, 1812, American forces clashed with British troops, Canadian militia, and native warriors. When the fighting ended, reports claimed that Ohio militiamen scalped 30 to 40 dead native warriors. There's no solid proof that they did the same to British soldiers, but the mere accusation fueled the war's brutality. Scalping became a powerful weapon of propaganda. American newspapers ran cartoons of British officers urging native allies to scalp Americans, painting the enemy as bloodthirsty savages. The British did the same, portraying Americans as wild men no better than the frontier they came from. The truth, however, was that scalping was a terrible reality on all sides. The only thing that changed was who told the story. But no one took scalping to the next level like the man who made it his life's work. Number 5. The Scalping King of the Wild West. He started as a hired gun, paid to hunt Apache warriors in the Mexican-American War. The job was simple: kill, scalp, collect the bounty. For a while, there was no shortage of targets, but as war thinned their numbers, the scalps dried up. Then the killing took a darker turn. His name was John Joel Glanton. He never stopped spilling blood, and he wasn't the only one. For decades, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila had battled Apache raids. In 1835, Sonora's governor, Manuel Escalante y Ravizo, put a bounty on Apache scalps, 100 pesos per head. The goal? Extermination. Other governors followed, paying for the scalps of men, women, and children. A massacre-for-profit system, and Glanton saw opportunity. When the war ended in 1848, Glanton lost his job. But men like him don't stay unemployed. He abandoned his wife and child, headed south, and formed the Glanton Gang. Outlaws, killers, and scalp hunters. Some were ex-soldiers. Some were escaped slaves. One, Samuel Chamberlain, later wrote of the horrors he witnessed. Glanton's greed didn't stop at scalp. His gang seized a ferry run by the Yuma tribe, luring travelers in before butchering them midstream. Mexican, American, it didn't matter. They looted the bodies and waited for the next victims. By the late 1840s, the scalp trade was booming. War parties from as far as Florida flooded Sonora's deserts, knives ready. By 1849, the trade peaked. Governors paid thousands for Apache scalps. Some offered up to $1,000 for a single warrior scalp. For the Glanton Gang, it was open season. They roamed the Sonora Desert, hunting any Apache band too small to fight back. Women, children, didn't matter. But the Apaches fought back, killed scalp hunters, and vanished into the landscape. Soon the trade dried up. Glanton, though, wasn't done. If Apache scalps were scarce, he'd scalp someone else. Mexican peasants, other natives, anyone with dark hair. The army wasn't checking. Scalps were scalps. So he murdered civilians, passed their scalps off as Apache, and kept the money flowing. His reputation as a butcher only grew. But some Apache warriors never ran. Some never stopped fighting. And no one symbolized the spirit more than Geronimo, the man who defied the U.S. Army for over 30 years. If you want the full story, don't miss our special 3-hour episode on his legendary resistance. Now, back to the blood-soaked frontier. Chihuahua paid out $17,896 in bounties that year, about $600,000 today. Then, Mexican authorities caught on. Governor Angel Trias Alvarez put a price on Glanton's head, nearly $270,000 in modern dollars. Suddenly, Glanton was the hunted. He fled to Sonora, then Arizona. At the Colorado River, he found a ferry run by A.L. Lincoln, a distant relative of that Lincoln. The ferry was a gold mine, hauling travelers to California's gold fields. Glanton wanted it. First, he got 6 of his men hired on, then he took over by force, driving Lincoln out. And, with the crossing under his control, he turned it into a highway robbery operation, charging travelers 10 times the fare or killing them and taking everything. But he made one mistake. The Yuma tribe ran a rival ferry, and when Glanton insulted their chief, he sealed his fate. The Yuma waited. Then, in April 1850, Glanton and his men left for San Diego to bank their profits, killing a man on the way just for sport. When they returned, exhausted, they laid down for a midday siesta. They never woke up. The Yuma chief gathered hundreds of warriors, and as Glanton's men slept, the Yuma rushed in, stabbing, bludgeoning, and scalping every last one. And that was the end of John Joel Glanton, a ghost of the bloody scalp trade, lost to history until Cormac McCarthy resurrected him in Blood Meridian, a novel so violent Hollywood won't touch it. Glanton lived by the knife, and in the end, the only difference was whose knife did the cutting. And while some men bled out in minutes, others lived just long enough to feel their skulls rot beneath their fingers. Number 6. Scalped alive. One man's nightmare. As you already know, scalping wasn't just for the dead. Many victims were still breathing, still fighting when the knife bit into their flesh. Some bled out in minutes, others survived, if you could call it that. For those who didn't get help, the clock was ticking. As mentioned earlier, with nothing covering the exposed bone, infection was almost certain. Over weeks or months, the skull would swell, crack, and slowly crumble away. Some men lived just long enough to feel their own skulls rot beneath their fingertips. And then there was Robert McGee. He was just 14 years old, riding west on the Santa Fe Trail with his family. The wagons rolled toward New Mexico, full of settlers chasing a better life. But one morning the Sioux came. Chief Little Turtle led the charge. Warriors stormed the wagon train, cutting down men, women, and children in minutes. Young Robert was shot and dragged before the chief. Little Turtle put another bullet in him, then pinned him to the ground with arrows. Robert was still alive. Our chief pulled a knife. With one quick motion, he scalped the boy while he was still conscious. Robert lay there, helpless, bleeding, watching as the warriors looted the wagons and rode off without a second glance. Hours passed. Then came the cavalry. Soldiers from the fort found Robert among the dead. Another boy was still breathing too, but barely. They rushed both of them back to the fort. The other boy didn't make it, but Robert did. Against all odds, he recovered. He lived through the agony of scalping, survived the infections that killed so many others, and kept on living. By 1880, decades after the attack, Robert McGee's disfigured head was an ugly reminder of what he had suffered. Once again, most scalping victims never got that chance. If the knife didn't kill them, infection did. And for the ones who lasted, the horror didn't end when the blood stopped flowing. It only got worse. Now, one scalping survivor is rare. 2, almost unheard of. But then again, the frontier was full of shocking surprises. Number 7. Scalped alive. Another man's hell. Texas was Comanche land, and survival meant living under constant threat. In 1840, a failed negotiation in San Antonio turned into a massacre when Texans slaughtered a Comanche delegation. In response, War Chief Buffalo Hump led 1,000 warriors on a rampage, burning towns, killing settlers, seizing horses, weapons, and scalps. As Texas burned, Comanches raided Mexico, battling Apache and Tonkawa rivals. By 1867, it wasn't the Comanche terrorizing the frontier, it was the Cheyenne, and one man would carry his own scalp. Cheyenne warriors Porcupine and Red Wolf raided a settlement, then reached the Union Pacific Railroad near North Platte, Nebraska. They wanted to stop a train. On August 6th, they set a trap. Wired a railroad tie across the tracks, lit a fire to draw someone in. Rail workers Pat Handeman and William Thompson approached by handcar. Then, crash, shots fired, Handeman died instantly. Thompson ran. A bullet tore through his shoulder. He dropped, playing dead. A Cheyenne grabbed his hair, pulled his head back, the knife sliced deep, his scalp was ripped away. They looted a handcar, found Spencer carbines but discarded them, unable to load. Then they tore up more track. Hours later, a freight train derailed at full speed. Engineer Brooks Bauer died on impact. Within the wreckage, Thompson, the scalp man, staggered out, holding his own scalp. He reached another train, escaped. Doctors in Omaha failed to reattach his flesh. Instead, it was preserved, a frightening relic of frontier brutality. But the violence didn't stop there. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 had already worsened tensions. Then, Colonel John Chivington's troops attacked a peaceful Cheyenne in Arapahoe village. On November 29th, he gave a chilling order. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. What followed was slaughter. Soldiers stormed in, killing men, women, and children. They cut bodies to pieces, scalping the dead and dying. No one was spared, not even pregnant women. John Smith, a white man, had a son in the village. When he came for the body, he saw the horror up close. I saw the bodies, cut all to pieces. The worst was White Antelope, a respected elder. After he was scalped, soldiers cut off his nose, ears, then his testicles, turning them into a tobacco pouch. Sand Creek was a massacre. 163 perished. And Chivington? He faced no punishment. Instead, his men paraded scalps through Denver, trophies from a village that had only wanted peace. Truly, the frontier was always a battleground, ruled by warriors who struck fear into settlers and soldiers alike. But who were the deadliest Native American tribes of the era? We break it all down in our newly released episode. Don't miss it. And if you want to see how the U.S. military fought back, check out our 4-hour episode on General George Crook, the man who outsmarted Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo with strategy, survival, and cunning. Scalping was war, its own kind of war. Terror. Business. It made men hunters, turned victims into trophies, and life into currency. But behind every scalp was a person, a warrior, a settler, a child, someone who lived, breathed, fought. History records the numbers. The truth? It's in the blood left behind. And this was Wild America. On the frontier, pain was guaranteed. A fever could cook you alive. A simple cut could rot to the bone. Doctors swore by cures that did more harm than good. Some men survived by sheer luck. Others weren't so fortunate. Would you have made it? But what types of diseases, illnesses, and injuries could afflict a man at that time? And would you have trusted a man in a butcher's coat or taken your chances alone? My name is Matt Francisco, and this is Wild America. This is the untold story of suffering on the American frontier. The wounds, the sicknesses, the so-called cures that killed as often as they healed. And sometimes the real danger came in the form of a man in a blood-stained coat. So let's start our countdown with number 7, ignorance of the time. Forget modern medicine. On the frontier, sickness was a death sentence, and doctors were as dangerous as the diseases they treated. They didn't know bacteria existed. No hand washing, No sterilization, just blood-stained fingers moving from gangrene to childbirth. As for hospitals, they were where the poor and dying went to be forgotten. People knew better than to trust a doctor. The best-selling books were home medical guides, not Bibles. These guides were packed with desperate advice for those who feared a man in a butcher's coat, and they had reason to. Licensing disappeared in many states, letting anyone call themselves a doctor. Quacks pushed ice baths, hypnotism, and Indian remedies. Even Coca-Cola started as a cure-all, but mainstream treatments were worse. Bleeding was the answer to everything: fever, infection, even broken bones. A good doctor would drain blood in gushes, and if the patient survived, he was strong. If not, he was doomed anyway. Then there was mercury, poison dressed as medicine. It filled calomel and blue mass pills, so toxic they made patients drool. Doctors took that as a sign of success. In truth, however, it was mercury poisoning. Frontier pharmacies, after all, were cabinets of desperation. Laudanum, black drops, and Dover's powder, each one laced with opium. Dragon's blood, a crimson resin, was sold to chase off bad blood. Even what we consider food today was medicine back then. Garlic, chili peppers, juniper berries. But the real currency was painkillers, because on the frontier, dulling the suffering was the only sure cure. Opium was everywhere. Tinctures, powders, even knockout drops for keeping wayward husbands in line. Back then, medicine was still attached to the ancient idea of the four humors: choler, black bile, blood, and phlegm. These were thought to control both health and character. For instance, a fever meant too much blood, so they drained it. Infection, madness, bad temper, bleeding was the cure-all. And if that failed, purging came next. Laxative, emetics, anything to flush the sickness out. Some doctors blistered the skin with chili poultices, hoping to draw out the poison. Others turned to cupping, which is basically heated glass pressed against flesh, raising swollen welts meant to suck sickness from the body. And sometimes, when blood no longer flowed on its own, they'd use cupping to drag out the last few drops. So, yeah, a frontier doctor was most often the best guesser around. Some had schooling, others apprenticed, but training was as much luck as skill. When one man swore by mercury, another called it poison. There was no way to settle an argument except through trial and error. Most folks, however, doctored themselves. Books like The Family Nurse or Gunn's Domestic Medicine guided them. But when disaster struck, a bullet, a broken bone, a fever that wouldn't break, they had no choice but to gamble on whatever help they could find. Granny's medicine wasn't much better than the doctor's, but at least it had logic. If it did something, anything, it was medicine. For example, peppermint oil warmed the skin, so it must ease pain. Asparagus made urine smell strange, so it must help the kidneys. And then there was the rule of similars. If it looked like the problem, maybe it cured the problem. A cold, camphor and hot water. Sore throat, tie bacon around your neck. A cough, boil poplar bark, beetroot, and 7 pounds of sugar till the scum stopped rising. Diarrhea, some let it run its course, believing it purged bad humors. If a cure was needed, blackberry root tea was the go-to fix. And then there was syphilis. It could be a slow death or a faster one. Mercury was the standard treatment, rubbed in, swallowed, or inhaled. And if that didn't kill you, arsenic might. As for snake bites, try a plant with snake-like roots, or perhaps cut the wound, suck the venom, and hope. One story tells of a child saved that way. Whiskey in his belly, a tobacco poultice on his skin. And that was straight out of the family handbook of 1855. But grannies and doctors agreed on one thing: the four humors ruled the body. Both feared imbalance like we fear infection today. To them, sickness was a battle inside, not random, and when it came, it struck fast. And then there was consumption, or tuberculosis. There was no cure at the time, just desperate remedies. Smoke tobacco, choke down cod liver oil, eat boiled onions. None of it worked. The sickness took its own time. Once again, most settlers relied on home remedies. Women carried cures from back east, men improvised. Wagon trains without doctors stuck close to those that had one, praying they wouldn't need 'em. After all, out here, death didn't knock. It walked right in. Now, bad doctors were one thing, bad water was another, and nothing killed faster. So, if you think quack medicine was deadly, wait until you hear about the disease that turned the wagon trails into mass graves. Number 6. Cholera. The name alone sent shivers down the spines of overlanders. No disease carried a deadlier reputation. It wasn't the only sickness stalking the trails. There was dysentery, smallpox, measles, mumps, influenza, and scurvy. They all took their toll, but that was the one they feared most. It hit in waves, sweeping the globe every few years like a biblical plague, claiming millions. Today, we worry about pandemics spreading by jet travel, but back then, it was sailing ships that carried the killer from port to port, striking down entire communities in a matter of days. Once it reached the wagon trails, it cut through emigrants like a scythe. The death rate was often 20% or higher, but it wasn't just the body count. It was how it killed. A man could wake up feeling fine, only to be doubled over by gut-wrenching cramps by noon. Diarrhea drained him to a husk, his body shriveling from dehydration, and by sundown, he was dead. And if the fever didn't take him in for the first 24 hours, he might fight through it for a week, but the odds weren't in his favor. Cholera was merciless, and once it took hold, there was no stopping it. And what you've seen so far is just a piece of the story. If you want the full experience, then watch our hours-long deep dives into the California and Oregon trails, where every step was a battle to survive. Don't miss it. Now, while one disease drained the body dry in hours, the next one made you suffer for days. Number 5. Dysentery. A different beast, but just as ugly. It crept in through dirty water, spoiled food, or squalid camps. Wherever filth festered, dysentery followed. It tore through armies in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, earning darkly humorous nicknames: the Runs, the Tennessee Trot, the Virginia Quickstep. But there was nothing funny about it. The sickness struck the gut first. Bloody diarrhea, fever, nausea, cramping that left men arched up, praying for relief. The real problem, however, was that doctors had no clue what caused it. They only treated symptoms, often making things worse. Purgatives were their go-to remedy: turpentine, castor oil, even lead acetate and sulfuric acid. And as we talked about earlier, if the disease didn't kill you, the cure might. Now, some survived, but many didn't. In 1863, Private John Leopold of the 74th Pennsylvania came down with dysentery. The surgeons threw everything at him: opium, silver nitrate, belladonna, calomel. 12 days later, he was dead. So yeah, dysentery wasn't always fatal, but when it was slow, ugly, and agonizing. And on the frontier, where clean water was scarce and doctors were guessing, it was as common as the dust on the trail. But not every sickness killed quickly. Some burned slow, leaving a man lost in fever delirium. Number 4. Typhoid fever. Born of filth, carried in contaminated water, and deadly in the crowded camps of war. Soldiers called it camp fever, but it had another name: a death sentence. It started like any illness: fever, aching joints, pounding head. Then came the gut-wrenching pain, non-stop diarrhea, and strange red rose spots blooming on the skin. In the worst cases, it stole a man's mind, leaving him thrashing in fever delirium before slipping into paralysis, then death. During the Civil War, disease killed more men than bullets. Typhoid alone claimed a quarter. Doctors, blind to its cause, bled the sick and blistered their skin, making them weaker. Opiates dulled the agony, but poisons like mercury chloride did nothing to save them. Some stayed alive just a bit longer, while others died fast. And for the unlucky, the sickness had a cruel trick: a ruptured bowel, tearing open without warning. If small, a slow death; if not, an agonizing end. Yet from all that suffering, knowledge grew. Union doctors studied the dead, searching for answers. Their work led to vaccines that would one day push typhoid into history. But for soldiers drinking from disease-ridden streams, that day was far away. And from all the fevers, typhoid was just one killer. There was also dengue fever, or breakbone fever. This wasn't, but it was feared all the same. The name said it all: pain like your bones were snapping in two. Men lay bedridden for days, some haunted by pain for weeks, even months. Only repeated infections granted immunity, a cruel trade indeed. As for the culprit, a mosquito, the same bloodsucker that spread malaria. Then there was the mountain fever. No one knew exactly what it was. Some swore it was Rocky Mountain spotted fever, spread by ticks. Others blamed scurvy, the slow wasting death that turned gums to bleeding wounds and left men too weak to stand. But one thing's for sure, the frontier had no shortage of killers. For every fever, every affliction that burned through settlements and camps, the cure, if there was one, always came too late. Yet there was another kind of suffering out there, one you couldn't bleed out or burn away. Number 3, prairie madness. On the Great Plains, the wind never stopped. It rattled sod houses, it made time move slow, and it left settlers alone with their own minds. The settlers came for land, for a fresh start, but what they found was silence, deep, maddening silence. They called it prairie madness, a slow, creeping unraveling. Depression, fits of rage. Some fled back east, dreams broken. Others weren't so lucky. Some turned violent. Some simply walked into the snow and never came back. By 1893, people had words for it. Eugene Verger Smalley put it plainly. Too many farmers and their wives were going mad, women especially, isolated, exhausted, sinking into despair. Some took their lives in ways so desperate, so final, that their stories burned into prairie folklore. Men weren't spared either. The same emptiness, the same crushing loneliness turned to rage, a shotgun blast, a knife in the dark. But it wasn't really a disease. It was life on the frontier. The Homestead Act had scattered families across massive stretches of land, neighbors miles apart, towns even further. A simple supply run could take a full day's ride. If sickness struck in the night, a doctor might never come. And if a woman was left alone while her husband hauled goods to town, she had no company but the wind. People weren't meant to live like that. And many, didn't. But prairie madness wasn't just isolation. It was the land itself. Winters hit like a hammer, burying homes in snow, trapping families for weeks. There was no sound but the non-stop shrieking of the wind. Then summer came. It was dry and punishing, scorching the earth before anyone could catch a breath. The land went on and on forever, flat, treeless, no shelter, no landmarks, just an ocean of grass under a sky too big to hold. But then the wind again. It never stopped. It kept pushing through walls, whistling under doors, shaking everything loose. Settlers spoke of it too often, persistent, alien, enough to wear a soul thin. Some clung to their old lives, pretending they could tame the frontier. Others let go, did what they had to. It didn't matter. The madness came anyway. And for newly arrived immigrants, it was worse. At least back home, they had tight-knit villages, familiar faces, a shared tongue. Here, they were stranded among strangers. For them, the loneliness dug deeper, and for some, it never healed. But did prairie madness strike women more? Some say yes. Women withdrew, fading into silence. Men, on the other hand, lashed out. At the land, at themselves, at their own families. And if the loneliness didn't break you, the summer complaint might. People blamed the heat, but it was bad food. Spoiled meat, sour milk, filth-covered hands, no refrigeration, no germ theory. And every summer it came in waves. Fever, cramps, worse. Just another hardship to endure, like the dust, the drought, and the storms. And this was life on the prairie. Too much space, too much silence, too much time alone. And while some men lost themselves to madness, others wasted away bit by bit. Number 2, tuberculosis. Also known as consumption, tuberculosis was a slow, merciless killer on the frontier. It ate away at the body, leaving its victims gaunt, fevered, and coughing up blood. Once it took hold, there was little hope. The disease flourished in close quarters, spreading through families, wiping out whole households. Poor ventilation, bad sanitation, and a lack of medical care only made things worse. Back then, folks still believed sickness came from bad air, not bacteria. For doctors, when you could find one, fresh air was the best remedy they knew. And so sanatoriums popped up in the countryside, where patients slept outside, wrapped in blankets, hoping the clean air would save them. Those who couldn't afford it built porches or moved their beds under the stars. Food was another so-called cure. Milk, eggs, meat, anything to keep the body strong. It may have helped some, but for most, tuberculosis was a slow death sentence. And when tuberculosis took hold, some doctors prescribed a drastic cure: move west. The dry air over there was thought to slow the disease, and thousands made the grueling journey, holding on to hope. Arizona, New Mexico, the Adirondacks, anywhere with fresh air and warmth promised relief. For the sick, travel was brutal. Weakened lungs couldn't handle the dust, the cold, or the endless jolting of wagon wheels. Some never made it, dying on the road before they could test the so-called cure. Once again, desperation fueled superstition. In New England, as whole families wasted away, locals turned to the dead for answers. The New England vampire panic saw grieving relatives dig up corpses, convinced the dead were feeding on the living. In 1892, Rhode Islanders exhumed Mercy Brown. Her body, well preserved from winter frost, sent terror through the town. They cut out her heart, burned it, and mixed the ashes into a drink for her dying brother. It didn't work. Even frontier doctors resorted to desperate experiments. Back in the 1840s, for instance, Kentucky physician Dr. John Croghan believed that Mammoth Cave's cool might cure tuberculosis. He bought the cave for $10,000, moved patients inside, and housed them in stone huts, hoping to shield them from the outside world. But the cold, damp air only worsened their condition. Many died, and the cave became their tomb. In his words, "I used to stand on that rock and blow the horn to call them to dinner. There were 15 of them, and they looked more like a company of skeletons than anything else." Unfortunately, tuberculosis claimed many lives long before real treatments emerged. In 1882, Robert Koch discovered the bacterium behind the disease, proving it wasn't caused by bad air or weak blood. But for those on the frontier, that knowledge came too late. Now, we've covered pain, madness, and sickness, but for our final and deadliest danger, we're talking about the kind that comes fast, silent, and straight for your heart. Number 1. Weaponry. Disease took more lives on the overland trails than anything else, but accidents weren't far behind. A loose horse, a misstep of a wagon, a streak of bad luck in a storm, any of these could maim or kill. But gunshot wounds? Those were a nightmare. Doctors had little to offer beyond a bandage and a shot of laudanum, and if a bullet or a musket ball stayed lodged inside, they had to dig it out, literally. To do that, a thin metal probe or even a sliver of bone was pushed into the wound, feeling blindly for the lead. If they found it, they'd reach in, sometimes bare-fingered, and pull it back through the path it had torn. Infection was almost a given, and most of these shootings weren't from skirmishes or duels, just carelessness. Firearms were unpredictable in untrained hands. Take James W. Nesmith's account from the trail. One morning, a lookout's rifle fired by accident, snapping a mule's neck. No one was surprised. The real shock was that more men hadn't been killed by their own clumsy handling. Burns were another hazard. Back then, the best remedy was egg whites, sealing the skin and keeping the wound from drying out. But when eggs ran short, emigrants reached for whatever they had, sometimes axle grease, a rough mix of animal fat, beeswax, and turpentine. It worked, though it wasn't pretty. Even with all the negatives we've discussed in this episode, doctors on the trails were always working. They'd ride miles off course to help the wounded and sick. As historian John Unruh Jr. put it, they were unsung heroes, especially during the gold rush. Then there were the arrows. A skilled warrior could fire up to 20 arrows in a minute, faster than a soldier's Springfield Model 1873 rifle could get all 15 rounds. But the real danger wasn't just speed, it was what an arrow could do once it struck. Army surgeons, used to patching up bullet wounds, weren't prepared for them. Bullets shattered bone, but arrows sank in deep, carving smooth channels that bled heavily. The worst part? The arrowhead. Many were bound to the shaft with animal sinew, which dissolved inside the body. That meant the tip stayed buried, causing festering wounds, cysts, or deadly infections, and removing it took major surgery. And every tribe had their own deadly design. Apaches, for instance, favored stone arrowheads that splintered on impact. Plains warriors, on the other hand, used iron tips that dug in deep. and some, including the Comanche, Apache, Sioux, and Cherokee, poisoned their arrows with rattlesnake venom. Now, limb wounds were survivable if the arrow passed through cleanly. If not, the limb was splintered and later operated on under chloroform or ether. Dr. Joseph H. Bill even developed forceps specifically for pulling out arrowheads, but a shot to the chest? That was usually fatal. If an arrow lodged in the ribs, surgeons tried to extract it with a trephine, a harsh tool meant for cutting through bone. Some men survived even with the arrowhead still inside them, but they were the exception, not the rule. An abdominal wound, on the other hand, was nearly always fatal. If blood loss didn't kill a man, infection would. Mexican soldiers, however, had a trick, wrapping thick blankets around their waists for protection. So, if an arrow lodged in the gut but the man lived, surgeons had one chance. They'd cut him open, loop a wire around the barbs, and ease the arrowhead free. And if his intestines spilled out, they'd stitch him up with catgut or gold wire, and hoped. Some carried arrowheads for years, like one poor soul who suffered constant incontinence until doctors cracked a bladder stone and found the culprit inside. Head wounds were worse. A deep hit meant slow, agonizing death. In 1866, an Apache arrow struck a soldier's skull. He rode 9 days to reach help, the arrowhead still lodged inside him. Surgeons cut into a swelling, releasing a gush of pus. He rallied, then his right side went numb. Paralysis set in, and on May 13th he died. The autopsy found his brain in ruins. Others beat the odds. Private William Drum took 2 arrows in 1867, one through his cheek, another nearly 2 feet deep in his back. 8 days later, surgeons cut it out, and by December, he was back on duty. Nat Crabtree wasn't so lucky. In 1868, he rolled out for cattle and came back full of arrows, 9 in total. Friends pulled a few out, but 5 had to wait until he reached Camp Cook. Hours after surgery, he was dead. Then there was Private Osborne of the 2nd Nebraska Cavalry. He had better luck. In 1863, 8 arrows hit him. One punched through his shoulder blade, slicing into his lung. He should have bled out, but he held on. For 3 years, he suffered every time he swallowed. Then in 1866, a doctor found the arrowhead still lodged near his windpipe, pressed against major vessels. They pulled it out clean. By 1869, he had fully recovered, though the government still refused him a pension. In another case, a U.S. officer took a Comanche arrow clean through the chest in 1881. High entry, low exit. He had a plan, however. He tied a silk handkerchief to the shaft and yanked it straight through. It worked. He healed, went back to duty. Now, the natives have their own way of pulling out arrows. Dr. W. Thornton Parker saw it firsthand. They used a split willow stick, hollowed out, and then slid down the wound to cover the barbs. Once in place, they tied it to the shaft and pulled the whole thing free in one smooth motion. And this was the frontier, a place where the cure was often worse than the disease, and where trusting the wrong doctor could be the last mistake you ever made. But surviving the frontier wasn't all about knowing what to do. You had to have the right tools and be bold enough to face the worst dangers head on. If you want to see how they did it, then check out our episodes on the 7 essential survival tools and the brutal dangers frontiersmen faced, only on our channel.
The fire burns low, the cold bites deep, stiffening fingers, numbing skin. A mountain man wakes before dawn. No blankets, no comfort, just the brutal edge of survival. He kicks the coals apart, tightens his gear, and grabs his rifle. Another day begins. Another day of watching his back. Out here, death is fast. One mistake, one wrong step, and you're done. There are grizzlies that can tear a man apart before he gets a shot off. There are storms that bury you alive. There are rivers that drag you under. And then there's the silence. Days, weeks, months. No voices, no faces, just your own thoughts closing in. Some men endure, some go mad. Is it the things that prowl just beyond the firelight? Is it the land itself, waiting for one moment of weakness? Or is it something else, something you never see coming? My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Let's start with a danger that gives no warning, the kind that kills fast. Danger number 1, hostile wildlife. Out here, death doesn't wait in the shadows. It walks beside you, and few things bring it faster than a grizzly bear. A full-grown male is a mountain of muscle and fury, bigger than a horse, taller than a man when it rears up. One swipe can annihilate the mightiest of men. One bite can crush bone. Grizzlies don't hunt men, but they don't fear them either. Cross paths at the wrong time, and you won't get a warning growl. Just a blur of fur, a roar that shakes your ribs, and a world that turns to pain. Hugh Glass learned that the hard way. It was late summer, 1823. He was moving through thick underbrush near the Grand River, rifle ready, eyes sharp. Then a grunt, a rustle. Before he could react, she was on him. A mother grizzly. And he was too close to her cubs. She hit him like a battering ram, knocking him off his feet before he could even raise his gun. Claws raked deep, the force of the attack leaving him dazed. He hit the ground hard, the weight of the bear pressing him down. Desperate, he reached for his knife, a last chance, a slim one. The blade struck, but it didn't stop her. She clamped down, her grip crushing, her breath hot against his face. He fought, but against her sheer power, it was like fighting a landslide. By the time his fellow trappers arrived, rifles up, Glass was barely clinging to life. They did what any practical men of the frontier would do. They waited. He was too far gone. The wounds were mortal. He'd never make it through the night. They left him with bare supplies, tasked 2 men with burying him when the end came. But Glass didn't die. What happened next became one of the greatest survival stories in history. Want the full tale? Watch our episode on Hugh Glass, only on our channel. Truly, his legend burned across the frontier. But he wasn't the only man to face the grizzly's wrath. Jedediah Smith was as tough as they came. Disciplined, unshakable, a man who didn't flinch in the face of danger. But he wasn't ready for the grizzly that nearly took his life. He was riding ahead of his group, scouting for a way through the Black Hills, when the bear hit. No warning, no time to react. It came crashing from the brush, jaws clamping down, knocking him clean off his horse. A crushing force, the world spinning as he hit the ground. Claws tore through his coat, ripping deep. By the time his men found him, he was barely conscious, broken, bleeding, but somehow still breathing. Most wouldn't have made it, but not Smith. He wasn't about to die in the dirt. He ordered his men to patch him up. No doctor, no medicine, just raw willpower. They did what they could with what they had, working through the pain. The wounds never healed right, however. His face was permanently injured so badly that for the rest of his life he couldn't fully close one eye. But he survived, and survival was all that mattered. Indeed, grizzly attacks were common, and survival was never guaranteed. Muzzle loaders were slow, too slow. You got one shot. Miss, and the bear would be on you before you could reload. Climbing a tree wasn't much better. Grizzlies could climb too. Some men stood their ground, hoping a well-placed shot would drop the beast before it reached them. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. And if the bear didn't kill you outright, the infection might. There were no doctors in the wild, no antibiotics, no second chances. Wounds worsened. Some men were found barely hanging on to life, their bodies ravaged, the earth around them marked by a desperate struggle to escape. But the risk didn't stop them. The money was in grizzly country. That's where the fur was. That's where fortune waited. Nevertheless, every man who entered grizzly territory knew one thing. Out here, you weren't the hunter. You were the hunted. Wolves and cougars were no less deadly than the grizzly. Different killers, same brutal reality. A single mistake could end badly. Wolves were scavengers, they were hunters. They were smart and relentless. And when hunger or disease twisted their instincts, they became something worse. At the 1833 rendezvous, a gathering where mountain men and indigenous traders met to swap goods and stories, a rabid wolf slunk into camp under cover of night. It went for the sleeping men, its jaws snapping, its fevered mind driven by something far worse than hunger. Warren Ferris, a trapper there, later recalled the horror. The wolf tore into multiple men before slipping back into the dark, vanishing like a ghost. But its damage was done. Days later, some of the bitten grew sick. Their bodies rebelled, their minds turned wild. One young man disappeared entirely, his fate lost to the wilderness. Even when wolves weren't maddened by disease, they were bold. In 1881, Jim Baker's daughter found that out firsthand. She was gathering cows near their homestead in Colorado when a gray wolf appeared. It didn't lunge, didn't snarl, just stood there watching. She tried to scare it off. It didn't flinch. She threw a rock. Still, it held its ground. That was the kind of predator mountain folk lived with, one that didn't always attack but never backed down. Then there were the cougars. Silent, unseen. A cougar wouldn't give you a warning growl. You'd never hear it coming. Mountain men didn't talk about fighting cougars the way they did bears or wolves, not because they weren't a threat, but because those who got too close rarely lived to tell about it. The big cat's screams would horrifically echo through the night, unsettling even the hardest men. Livestock vanished. Sometimes so did people. There weren't many written accounts of direct attacks on trappers, but the fear was real. You didn't have to see a cougar to know it was there. You just had to know how the world felt different when you weren't alone. The wilderness never gave a man a break. If the beast didn't get you, something else would. The land itself was an enemy, merciless, unpredictable, and always ready to kill. Danger number 2, harsh weather conditions. Beyond the claws and fangs of the wild, mountain men fought against an even colder threat, nature's fury. The mountains didn't care if you were tired, hungry, or hurt. They didn't care if you were prepared. When the weather turned, you either adapted or you died. The American West was untamed, its climate as brutal as the terrain. Winters slammed down hard, burying the land under deep snow, dropping temperatures to bone-cracking lows. Storms rolled in fast, smothering the sky, turning clear paths into whiteout nightmares. A single mistake, misreading the wind, waiting too long to make camp, could cost a man his life. James Clyman knew this well. He and his party were deep in the Rockies when the blizzard struck. No warning, no mercy. The wind howled, driving the snow sideways, cutting through their clothes like knives. They had no choice but to dig in, huddle beneath a makeshift shelter, and wait. Days passed. Supplies ran low. The cold chewed at their bones, but they held on. Survival in these mountains wasn't only about endurance. You had to know the land, read the signs, and move before disaster hit. Trappers learned to stitch their own wounds, set their own broken bones, and rely on nothing but their wits and grit. They wrapped themselves in stiffened deerskin for warmth, fished frozen rivers for food, and fought to keep their fires burning against the wind. But no amount of skill could tame the mountains. A sudden storm could leave a man stranded, lost, freezing to death under a sky that didn't care. And winter was only one of the dangers. Danger number 3, treacherous terrain. The American frontier was indeed a land of extremes, enormous, wild, and as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Mountain men crossed every kind of landscape, dense forests, scorching deserts, towering peaks. But some of the deadliest places weren't marked on any map. Narrow canyons were among them. They offered passage through rugged country, but they also held a hidden threat: flash floods. A storm could be miles away, unseen, unheard. But in an instant, a dry canyon could become a raging river. Walls of water and debris tore through the narrow rock corridors, leaving no time to run, no way to climb. A man caught inside had little chance. Rivers were another gamble. A lifeline one moment, a death trap the next. Heavy rains turned them wild, currents ripping away anything in their path. Crossing was always a risk. One slip on a slick rock, one misstep in a deep channel, and a man and his gear were gone. Add a panicked horse, and disaster came fast. Then there were the mountains, loose shale that crumbled underfoot, hidden crevasses waiting to swallow the unwary, rock slides that came without warning. A single mistake meant a long fall or a slow death buried beneath the weight of the land. The western deserts, too, had their own merciless ways. Days scorched, nights froze, and water was a cruel mirage. Wander too far off course, and a man could be dead before he even knew he was lost. Even the forests were no sanctuary. Thick underbrush tangled a man's feet. Hidden drop-offs waited behind dense trees, and fallen logs concealed dangers of their own. Every step required caution. Every moment demanded awareness, and although we talked about the weather before, it's worth mentioning the snowstorms that buried trails, which trapped the unprepared. Then there was lightning that sparked wildfires, setting the world ablaze in a matter of minutes. On a side note, don't forget to check out our channel for the survival tips frontiersmen used to face these challenges. But yeah, surviving the frontier also meant one had to respect the land. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the frontier made sure you paid the price. And out here, the wilderness had quieter weapons, ones you couldn't see coming. Danger number 4, diseases and lack of medical care. Infection. Disease. A scratch could fester. A fever could burn a man out from the inside. And when sickness took hold, there was no doctor, no medicine, just the land, watching, waiting. Mountain men didn't just battle the wild, they fought their own bodies. Cholera was a silent killer, striking without warning. One bad drink of water, one meal touched by unclean hands, and a man could go from healthy to dead in a day. It drained the body dry, violent diarrhea, non-stop vomiting, the life leaking out faster than it could be replaced. No treatment, no cure. The Oregon Trail, for instance, became a graveyard. Between 1849 and 1855, cholera cut through wagon trains like a scythe, leaving men, women, and children buried in shallow, unmarked graves. No one understood how it spread. No one could stop it. Travelers recorded the horror in their diaries. One testimonial goes, "There was an epidemic of cholera. All along was a graveyard. Most any time of day you could see people burying their dead. Some places 5 or 6 graves in a row. It was a sad sight. No one could realize it unless they had seen it." Even those who escaped cholera faced other dangers: smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery. Disease took more pioneers than hostile raids or accidents. You see, rivers weren't just barriers to cross. They carried sickness with them. Another pioneer woman's diary mentioned, "Cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis are spreading quickly. Many are dying. Crossing rivers was probably the most dangerous thing we did. Some people drowned, and several wagons collapsed while crossing the river." For the mountain men, isolation made everything worse. A deep cut could turn to sepsis. A fever could burn out of control. There were no hospitals, no trained healers, only crude remedies, superstition, and luck. A man's survival depended on his own grit and the mercy of a land that gave none. Even children understood the stakes. another testimonial recorded by a child. Out of all the crossings we have done, only one wagon has tipped, but the family themselves were fine. Our danger, rather than weather and natives, is disease. Cholera and dysentery have taken a toll on our wagon train, or so the adults say. Out here, survival had a lot to do with luck, and when disease came, luck often ran out. Speaking of the Oregon Trail, we've covered these brutal struggles in depth, a 7.5-hour-long episode on Oregon Trail survival stories, a 3.5-hour-long episode on a family's harrowing journey across the California Trail, and many more on mountain men survival, all exclusively on our channel. In the meantime, beyond the threats of predators and harsh weather, mountain men faced another harsh adversary. Danger number 5, starvation and food scarcity. You see, these frontier mountain men depended on hunting and foraging, and when game disappeared or they ventured into unknown lands, hunger came knocking at their doors. Mountain men ventured deep into the mountains, living year-round close to their work. Their survival depended on finding wild game. But when animals were scarce, desperation set in. Both indigenous peoples and mountain men would scrape rotting flesh from animal carcasses, eating whatever they could to keep death at bay. Isolation made finding food even harder. Cut off from help, they relied on their wits and knowledge of the land. They ate roots, berries, and even boiled leather when necessary. Starvation wasn't just a personal battle. Entire expeditions faced it. The Coppermine Expedition of 1819 to 1822, led by Sir John Franklin, is a grim example. The team faced severe food shortages, leading to desperate measures for survival. To combat food scarcity, mountain men learned preservation techniques from indigenous peoples. Pemmican, a mix of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, became a staple. This high-calorie, long-lasting food sustained trappers during long journeys when fresh game was scarce. Despite these measures, uncertainty was a constant companion. The threat of starvation demanded resilience, adaptability, and deep knowledge of the wild. However, there was still another danger deadlier than any beast in the wild. Other men. Danger number 6, conflicts with indigenous peoples. One thing's for sure, the wilderness wasn't empty. It belonged to the tribes who had lived on these lands for centuries. Some traded with the mountain men. Others saw them as invaders. The result? Bloodshed, ambushes, battles that carved the fate of the frontier in blood. One of the first large-scale clashes came in 1823, the Arikara War. William Henry Ashley and 70 trappers pushed up the Missouri River straight into Arikara territory. Tensions were high. The Arikara, hardened warriors, blamed these outsiders for bad trade and past betrayals. Before dawn, they struck. Musket fire, arrows, chaos. 14 trappers fell. 10 more were wounded. The rest barely escaped, shoving off into the river, leaving the dead behind. News reached the U.S. military, and for the first time, soldiers marched beyond the Missouri to retaliate. Villages burned. Warriors fell back. The message was clear. The frontier was a war zone. Some learned that lesson firsthand. John Coulter, a veteran of the Lewis and Clark expedition, knew the land better than most. But in 1809, while trapping near the Three Forks of the Missouri, he was captured by the Blackfoot. His companion was killed on sight. As for Coulter, he was given a choice: run. The natives stripped him naked and set him loose, then chased him down like a wounded elk. Barefoot, bleeding, he ran for his life. Through brush, over rough ground, through miles of open prairie. The Blackfoot warriors closed in. He could hear them gaining. Desperate, he reached the river. He dove, disappeared under a pile of driftwood, heart pounding as the warriors searched the shore. Hours passed before they gave up the hunt. When the last shadow disappeared, Coulter crawled from the river and started walking. 200 miles, barefoot, alone, half dead when he finally reached safety. If you want the full scoop, we've got an 8-hour episode on John Coulter, so don't forget to check it out. But for now, just know this. Some battles lasted for years, fought in the mountains and across wide plains. Kit Carson knew this all too well. One of the West's most famous frontiersmen, he spent decades battling and trading with indigenous tribes. The Blackfoot, in particular, were a constant enemy. Masters of ambush, they struck hard and vanished just as fast. Carson and his men fought back with the same ferocity. In 1830, one expedition turned into a running war, skirmish after skirmish, neither side giving an inch. It was all about survival. Yet not all fights were hit and run. Some were all-out wars. In 1832, at Pierre's Hole in present-day Idaho, American trappers and their Nez Perce allies met a war party of Gros Ventre warriors. It started with tension. It ended in blood. Arrows and musket fire filled the air. The trappers had guns, but the Gros Ventre refused to back down. The battle raged on. It was ferocious. When it was over, the trappers held the ground. But they knew the truth. The land would never be won without blood. And as settlers pushed deeper into indigenous territories, the fighting only grew. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 showed just how far things had spiraled. A Colorado militia attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village, slaughtering up to 163 people, mostly women and children. It was pure extermination. The retaliation, however, was swift. Raids, ambushes, burned settlements. The West was on fire, and the cycle of blood wouldn't end anytime soon. For the mountain men, one wrong move, one step into the wrong valley, and they weren't hunters anymore. They were hunted. The West wasn't simply a land of opportunity, it was a battlefield where every sunrise could be a man's last. As we've seen so far, the wilderness could break a man in many ways. Claw, tooth, hunger, disease, tomahawk, those were obvious. But there was another enemy, one that crept in slow, hollowed a man out from the inside. Danger number 7, isolation and psychological strain. You see, a mountain man could go months without hearing another human voice. No law, no comfort, no familiar faces. Just the infinite sight of trees, rivers, and sky. Some thrived on it, others lost themselves to it. Isolation wore at the mind. Alone for months, even years, they had no one to lean on, no voice to answer their own. Fear aggravated. The weight of survival pressed heavy, every day a gamble against nature, predators, and hostile encounters. The strain showed. Some became reclusive, speaking to no one when they did return to civilization. Others grew restless, reckless. The Great Plains settlers called it prairie madness, depression, paranoia, sometimes violence. The symptoms were strangely familiar among mountain men, shaped by the same brutal loneliness. But those who survived found ways to cope. Some forged ties with native tribes, learning their ways, taking wives, finding a place in their world. Others lived for the annual rendezvous, a wild, raucous gathering where trappers traded goods, swapped stories, and reminded themselves they were still human. Some wrote, some simply talked, to themselves, to the trees, to ghosts of old friends long gone. To last out there, a man had to be more than strong. He had to make peace with his own mind. Because in the end, the silence could be just as deadly as the grizzly. After all, the wild didn't care if you were strong, smart, or skilled. It only cared if you could survive. Some men did, most didn't. And out there in the wilderness, the land always won. He traded 15 rifles and 15 blankets to marry a native woman. Without priests and no wedding ring, he simply laid out his trading goods on the ground for bartering. But did the woman choose him, or was he chosen for her? How many deals like that do we call history, and how many do we call love? And what other bizarre traditions did mountain men practice back in the day? This episode is what the history books won't say, but we will. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. And now, let's start at the very top. Number 1. Intermarriage. In the early 1800s, where rivers split the land and valleys opened wide, mountain men took native wives. It wasn't strange. It was simply survival. These men, these trappers, scouts, loners, lived far from towns. A wife from the tribe meant safety. She meant you'd eat through winter. She knew the land. She knew the signs. When you marry her, you step into a whole way of life. Trade went easier that way. You moved pelts without fear. The tribe gained too: iron tools, powder, and cloth from far places. It was give and take. Some men stayed, some left when the snows melted and the beaver runs dried up. But for a time, they shared something real. And in that space between two worlds, families grew. Children born with pale hair and dark eyes. Homes where two languages echoed by the fire. The line between us and them faded. You see, white women were rare out there. If a man wanted kin, he looked to the people who were already home. And sometimes the union was formal, blessed by elders, marked by gifts. Other times it just was. No preacher, no paper. The wild didn't ask for proof. Then came summer, the rendezvous. A valley high in the mountains, wind running clean through the grass. Hundreds gathered, trappers, traders, tribes. They brought pelts, powder, knives, sugar, and something else. Some came looking for wives. It wasn't romance, not in the way townsfolk might know. It was goods laid down on hides: beads, tin, a rifle, maybe a horse. One man once brought 15 rifles and 15 blankets, said he wanted to marry. Another brought red cloth and silver, beads that caught the light. These were signals. Can I protect her? Can I provide? Will I stay? The family watched, listened, judged. Not just the offer, but the man, his face, his hands, what he might bring or what he might bring down. It was slow and quiet. A nod, a silence, then a deal struck. Sometimes a fire was lit and two lives moved forward, but there was more underneath. There was risk, there was trust, there was the pull of wanting to belong, and sometimes the woman chose. She stepped forward, offered her hand, not for love alone, but for her people. If he took it, he took on more than a wife. He took on her world, her kin, her fights. He hunted with her brothers, ate with her uncles, slept in her tent. In return, they got steel, cloth, and fire in new shapes. As mentioned earlier, most of these unions had no church, no preacher, and no rings. All they had was a feather passed hand to hand, a few words spoken quietly, maybe a drum beat, maybe the click of sticks keeping time. It was enough. For the woman, it was a crossing. She left behind her mother's stories, her sister's songs. She stepped into something unfamiliar: wood smoke in cabins, snow through the cracks, a man who didn't know the land like she did. But she saw the edge of something else too, a way to move, to speak where decisions were made, to carry her people's voice into new spaces. She kept her mountain man of a husband alive. She sewed his coat when it tore, fed him when meat ran low, taught him how to walk quietly through snow, how to read the sky, how to dig for roots when his hands shook from hunger, and he gave back. He used his rifle to guard her kin, traded on her behalf at the fort, paid off debts that might have dragged her people down. And together they built something small, a life held together by trust, a life that worked in places where nothing else did. Take William Bent, a trader. He married Owl Woman of the Cheyenne. Aside from love, it had mostly to do with power, peace, connection. Their bond tied his fort to her people. She became the bridge, the steady voice in two worlds. She raised 4 children, held tempers down when talks ran hot. She mattered. For Bent, marriage to Owl Woman gave him standing. It gave him reach. It gave him reason to keep the peace, and a reason for the tribe to do the same. For her father, White Thunder, the marriage brought something back. Honor, position, a daughter at the center of something bigger than either side alone. Even speaking to a Cheyenne woman carried weight. You didn't just walk in and ask. Bent knew that. He followed the steps. First came the ponies, traded with White Thunder as a sign of respect. Then came the visits, always watched. Yellow Woman, Owl Woman's sister, made sure the line wasn't crossed. The Cheyenne believed in patience. No touching, no promises, until they were real. And when Bent was ready, he returned with horses, gifts, and tobacco. He shared a pipe with White Thunder, slow puffs under open sky, a ritual of peace, a way to speak without words. Owl Woman wanted the marriage, but the final word was her father's. It was he who placed her hand in Bent's, then added, Yellow Woman's hand too. That gesture meant Bent was now tied to both sisters, not just to one woman, but to the family. The wedding took place near the fort in 1835, maybe 1837. Sources disagree. But the moment itself was clear. A lodge was built for them. Owl Woman was carried into it. Bent handed out gifts like blankets, tools, and trinkets, symbols of abundance, of commitment. Then, after the marriage, Bent was made a Cheyenne sub-chief. He was now family. He was kin. And he wasn't the only one. James Beckworth, born in 1798, became part of the Crow. They said he looked like the lost son of a chief. So they brought him in. He married a chief's daughter, maybe more than one. He fought in battles, rose to war chief. We've got a special episode on Beckworth on our channel. Almost 12 hours filled with his incredible one-of-a-kind story. So be sure to check it out when you're done watching this one. In the meantime, there was also Jim Baker, who married Marina, Chief Washaki's daughter. He too was taken in, lived among the Shoshone, and became one of them. And you know it wasn't rare for these men to have more than one wife. Some tribes allowed it. The men followed those ways. However, the children born from these unions walked 2 worlds. They spoke at least 2 tongues. They knew 2 ways of life, and that gave them power, but also hardship. As America pushed west, laws came. Laws that said these marriages didn't count, that they weren't legal, that mixed children had no rights to land or name. Still, those children were bridges. They helped translate during treaties. They helped avoid war. They were the middle ground. And communication wasn't simple. People spoke in fragments, some English, some French, some tribal tongues, some Spanish. And when words failed, they used signs. A hand gesture could mean danger, or welcome, or trade. Everyone used what they had. A little of this, a little of that. A patchwork language for a patchwork life. And that's where the next bizarre tradition begins, with the language born between worlds. Number 2, hybrid tongues. Out in the mountains, far from cities and soft speech, men made their own way of talking. They needed to. No one spoke the same. French, English, Spanish, Lakota, Crow, Ute. Words from all sides thrown together, hammered into shape by need. Trade needed talk after all. Heck, survival needed talk. So they built something rough but useful, a new kind of language. It wasn't proper. Not was it polished. Just enough to make sense. Just enough to get by. They called it jargon, or pidgin, and it came alive in the wild places like rendezvous camps, fur posts, river crossings, where traders, trappers, and tribes met, Métis, Americans, French Canadians, Mexicans, dozens of native nations. No one spoke the same, but all needed to understand. So they pointed, gestured, talked with their hands. Plain sign language filled the gaps. Words were borrowed, bent, broken down. Grammar stripped to the bone. Sometimes one word carried the weight of a sentence. Other times, a chain of pieces stuck together said what had to be said. That's how native languages worked. Long, braided words with meaning folded deep inside. But they weren't meant to be forced into French or English shapes. That only twisted the meaning more. Even missionaries who tried to learn these native tongues found it hard. These languages weren't simple. They were built in layers, tied tight with rules that no one wrote down, only passed along. You needed someone patient to teach you how they fit. And even among tribes who shared language roots, like the Quapaws, the Omahas, the Osages, words drifted. Time split them apart. The river took one group downstream, another went up, and the last stayed in the middle. Their tongues followed. What once was shared turned strange. So the pidgin stayed. It was a tool, not a mother tongue. No one's first language, but everyone's second. Built from scraps, forged from need, spoken with hands, with eyes, with fragments of 10 worlds pressed into one. Furthermore, in addition to pidgin, at the rendezvous where hundreds gathered, they traded, shouted, joked, and argued in a broken mix of every language they'd picked up on the trail. This Rocky Mountain pidgin never made it to paper. It came and went with the wind. It lived in the mouths of men and then disappeared. Unlike Chinook jargon up north, which made its way into books, this mountain talk stayed wild, passed from man to man, campfire to campfire. Then, after 1840, the world started changing. Government men came. Missions opened. Schools pushed English. The old way of talking, patched together from need, started to fade. But for a time, it held. The words stuck to their gear and their stories. They called cheap trinkets foufara, a twist on the French word for show-off. Tobacco was plain old baccy. They buried pelts and powder in a cache, from the French word for to hide. Their leader was the bouchouet, a butchered version of bourgeois. They smoked kinnikinnick, bark from native land. They drank aguardiente, their slurred version of agua ardiente. A fool was a pilgin, taken from Chinook jargon's word for pigeon. As for canoes, they had their own word for that too. Hollerwoods, pulled from native tongues. So, yeah, these words weren't pretty. But they worked, and each one told a story. Each one carried a piece of the wild. Now the list of these words is long. New ones pop up every time a trapper's tale gets told. But let's take a look at a few more. For instance, when we say Ashley and the boys, we're talking about General William Ashley's first supply runs to the trappers. He brought trade goods out west so they didn't have to carry pelts all the way back to St. Louis or Taos. And his boys were the traders who made it possible. Also, Afer means before. Beaver sharn is a stick chewed by a beaver. Mountain men prized it as a lucky charm and medicine, especially when they gathered several at camp. Beans means seeing how, and Bav simply stands for above. And here's one many of us already know. Cuz means because. Cap is the percussion cap on a gun, and caps up means you've loaded one. Come and comed mean come over and came over. Cahoots are partners. To chick. Something is to check it, so chicken your traps means you're checking your traps. Sightin' is exciting. And when you hear folks say dagnabbit, they're cursing a missed shot or a bad break. Done and does cover did and does. M is them. Forget is forgot. Fur means for. Get means get, and goad means went. A hawk is a tomahawk, and hoss is horse. Hafta means have to, and inta means into, and Jawan is talking about old times. Now, when someone knows where his stick floats, he knows exactly what he's doing. Catchin', catch, and catched are all about catching something. Liquor is whiskey. Looky means look here. Muzz is any muzzle-loaded gun. More strangely, a man is a squaw's squaw, and knowin' means to know. Knowed means should have known. Ol means old. Onlyest is the only one. Purty is pretty. Pretty means in just a bit. Plumb center is a perfect shot. A powder horn is a buffalo horn filled with black powder. And a patch is the cloth that wraps your ball before loading. To plug a critter is to shoot it. Now, when you rected something, you stood it back up. Sumpin' means something. Skeert is scared, and skedaddle means to get out fast. Splain means explain. Twinkst means between. Top knot is the hair on your head. Was is was. We's is all of us. Woulda is would have. Woked is woke up. Warned is warned. And finally, your means your or you are, and zactly means exactly. And when the words ran out, the real currency showed its teeth. Number 3, pelt currency. They called it a plu, a beaver skin trimmed and dried, soft underfur, dense and warm, worth its weight in powder, lead, and whiskey. And out in the Rockies, plus were money, real money. Trappers scraped the hides clean the same day they pulled them from the trap. Then they stretched them tight on willow hoops, let them dry in the sun till they curled like thick leather coins, each one neat, round, and ready for trade. We've got a new episode out, by the way, describing a full day in a trapper's life out in the wilderness, in his cabin, how he traps beaver, and so on. Be sure to check it out when you have time. But yeah, at first, the mountains were filled with beaver, bigger and better than anything back east. Their underfur was gold to European hatters. It made the best felt, warm, tough, water-shedding, perfect for top hats. And every summer the big supply trains rolled in, bolts of cloth, kegs of whiskey, lead, powder, knives. The rendezvous camps sprang up, and for a few wild weeks the mountains roared with trade. Plus changed hands fast, a beaver skin for a drink, a handful for a gun. Trappers hollered, drank, told lies by firelight. Rich one moment, broke the next. That's how it was. Traders also brought blankets marked with black lines, Hudson's Bay Point blankets. The lines were there to show size, nothing more. But mountain men saw a way to count. One line, one plu. So a blanket with 6 marks meant it cost 6 beaver skins. It was simple and honest. You could trust the thread more than a stranger's word. And that's how bookkeeping worked out here. Fur companies had ledgers too. Neat columns, dollar signs, ink that froze in the cold. If a man took goods on credit, they kept track, and sometimes he got a paper note instead of coin. Write it down to St. Louis, hand it over, walk out with cash. It worked like a company store, but it meant you were tied to that company. Same way miners owed the shack. Everything had its price in beaver. Even other pelts had their place on the scale. For instance, 1 plu is equivalent to 2 otter pelts, or 2 fox pelts, or 1 wildcat pelt, or 1 wolf pelt, or 1 black bear pelt, or 1 deer pelt. 2 plus, however, can be traded for 1 moose pelt, But not all beavers were equal. Made beaver meant clean, dried, and ready to trade. That was prime. Anything less, coarse, greasy, torn pelts that brought a lower price. Some trappers tried to cheat, patching holes with scrap fur. But wary buyers had sharp eyes, though. They saw the stitch marks. Now 50 plues made a bundle, 100 pounds easy, wrapped tight in deerskin, buried in pits till summer. That's how you kept your wallet safe, underground. By the time of the rendezvous, trappers came down from the high country, riding pack horses heavy with fur. A man's wealth slung over the saddle, smelling of sweat and beaver musk. At trading posts, every blanket had tally marks. 1 mark for 1 plue. 4 marks meant 4 skins gone. That's how you paid. A prime plue could fetch $6. That was the brag. $6 a plue prime. But not all hides were equal. Scarred, torn, or chewed, may be worth a cup of coffee. Maybe not. Everything had its price. A flintlock or rifle might run 12 plues. Sugar cost 1 pelt. 2.25 kilos of sugar cost 1 plue. Whiskey, maybe 2 pelts. Needles, cloth, awls, beads, each had its price in fur as well. For instance, 2 scissors cost 1 plue, 20 fish hooks cost 1 plue, and 1 pair of shoes also cost 1 plue. It was a strange kind of economy, one where your fortune lived on the backs of animals. When the beavers were plenty, money flowed. And when they were gone, so was your living. However, plue prices changed with the times. In the late 1820s, beavers were aplenty, pelts stacked high. But by the early 1830s, their numbers dropped. Beaver got scarce. London and Boston still paid top dollar nonetheless. Demand stayed high over there, and that drove the value up. But then fashion changed and moved on. Silk hats took the place of beaver felt. Buffalo robes also rose in demand, and the pelt market changed. And just like that, the beaver lost its worth. But back when their bags were full, mountain men picked sides and played war during rendezvouses. Number 4, mock battles. Aside from trade, rendezvous were also for showing off, for testing fortitude, for playing at war. Out there in the high country, once the horses were fed and the goods swapped, the men turned to something else, something loud, something fierce, though no blood was meant to spill. A horn would sound. Men would grab their gear, powder horns, rifles without bullets, tomahawks. Then 2 sides formed, drawn from trappers, voyageurs, sometimes a few native allies. They would then pick their spots behind logs, rocks, brush. Then it began. Shouts would crack through the woods. Muskets snapped, shields jangled, dust rose in clouds as men charged, ducked, and crawled. It looked like war, but it wasn't. They called it a mock battle, a rough kind of theater, a test. The idea didn't come from one place. Native warriors had long trained with war games. Real moves, no real wounds. Trappers from Europe brought memories of drills and marches. The 2 ways met out here in pine corridors and creek beds. They fought hard, even without bullets. Flanking, feinting, ambushes from behind brush. The rules were loose, but the effort was real. Crowds would gather to watch. Women, traders, cooks, anyone who wasn't fighting. They shouted bets, laughed at blunders, cheered clever moves. For the mountain men, this was wonderful practice, a way to sharpen what kept them alive. Quick hands, quiet feet, eyes that could read a ridge like a book. And when it was over, they'd laugh, slap backs, and pass bottles. But for a while, they were wolves again, not traders or drifters. They were simply men in the wild, proving they still had the edge. Afterward, the men would come together with grins, handshakes, and shared swigs from a whiskey jug. Winning wasn't the point. Losing wasn't shameful. What mattered was how you fought, how you moved, how you made the other side sweat. In some years, old rivalries flared. For instance, men from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company squared off against trappers wearing the American Fur Company's colors. They'd paint themselves up, borrow tomahawks, act out scraps with the Blackfeet or Crow. Younger scouts, hungry for respect, danced the steps they'd seen from Nez Perce or Lakota warriors. The older men laughed, nodding at the memories stirred up, some from out east, some from battles long past on the plains. It was basically a ritual, a way to build trust, to test the edge of a man and see what lay beneath. And when the noise died down, they marked the end with a truce. After all, out here, there weren't many laws. But there was honor. And that night, the firelight made it real. But by the 1840s, the trade slowed. The rendezvous stopped. The games faded. But the stories held on, in journals, in scraps of old newsprint. But when it concerned natives, after you've earned their respect, you then earn a name. Number 5, taking on new names. Now, mountain men set their traps and traded fur, but that wasn't the whole of it. They ate by the same fires, slept under the same stars, married into the tribes, learned the languages, wore buckskins, wore moccasins, and when they stayed long enough, the indigenous people gave them names. Not just nicknames or tags, but real names, names with weight, names with meaning. You see, in native life, a name isn't fixed. It can change with time, like rivers do. You're born with one, maybe, but as you grow, through dreams, through danger, through deeds, it can change. You either earn a name, or it finds you, a vision, a storm, a scar, an act of courage. These could all shape a new name. Elders would decide, sometimes in ceremony, and the mountain men became part of that. Not all of them, but many. As we talked about earlier in the episode, they became brothers, fathers, husbands. They became Crow, Ute, Blackfeet. And with that came names that fit their new lives. Names that told who they were, not where they came from. For example, modern names like Ashley, Chloe, and Olivia may indicate faint traces of nature. Ash tree, green shoot, olive branch. But it's different. The link's weaker now. Industrial life stripped nature from names, called them old, called them soft. Still, there's a gap. In tribal life, a name can mean us, not me. A tribal name might say the people or human beings. It ties you not only to your family, but to everyone. Imagine growing up with a name that means all of us, not just you. Now that carries a weight, a kind of belonging you can feel in your bones. And beyond even that, there are names no one hears. Sacred names, secret ones. Only the person and the medicine man know them. Held close, spoken rarely. Some men leave behind legends. Others leave behind names. James Pearson. Beckworth was both. Born into chains, he broke free and never looked back. He found his place with the Crow, not as a visitor, but as one of them. They watched him, they tested him, and they named him Morning Star, the Antelope, enemy of horses, Medicine Calf, and then Bloody Arm. And that one stuck. It came after a fight where he grabbed a bow from an enemy's hands, blood running down his arm, they say. It wasn't just the wound, though. It was the act, the courage, the fire. The Crow saw it, and they named it. He wore that name like a badge, a mark of respect. Then there was Thomas Fitzpatrick, Irish. A gun misfire wrecked his hand. The tribe saw it and gave him a new name, Broken Hand. It followed him the rest of his life, long after the mountains, long after the wars. Even a Colorado peak bears it now. Broken Hand Peak. The land still speaks his name. Jim Bridger had two names too. The white trappers called him Old Gabe, but the Crow, they called him Cassipi, or Blanket Chief. You see, he'd once offered blankets during a tense talk. It was meant as a gift, a peace offering. So they saw the gesture, felt the honesty, and they gave him a name that said who he was, a man who bridged the gap. Jim Bridger was one heck of a frontiersman. Be sure to check out his 9-hour episode on our channel when you have the time. There was also William Shirley Williams, Old Bill. He spent decades with the Osage. He lived their ways, sang their songs. They named him Lone Elk, not just for the way he moved, but for who he was, strong, quiet, respected. Kit Carson also earned the name Rope Thrower from the Navajo, not just for hunting, but for how he moved in a fight. Jim Baker, too. When he saved a Shoshone chief's daughter, he was brought into the tribe. They called him Red-Haired Shoshone. It wasn't entirely about his looks. It was more of a statement. He's ours now. So, yeah, these names weren't given lightly. They were earned, fought for, lived. And long after the mountains quieted, long after the guns and traps were put away, those names stayed. But now, ask yourself, what gets remembered as history? And what gets buried with the bones?
You don't hear the first shot, just the glass breaking and the scream. You're in a saloon, midnight, tobacco smoke filling the air. Cards slap the table. Someone loses big. A chair scrapes back. No words, just a flash of iron. Gunfire. A man drops. Blood on the floor. Everyone freezes. Meanwhile, in the hills outside, cattle rustlers cut barbed wire fences by moonlight. And elsewhere, a stagecoach rides through a narrow pass. Unaware, 2 men wait in the brush with bandanas and shotguns. And far out in the Rockies, a trapper guts a mule deer by firelight, his hands shaking from the cold. He's down to his last bullets. He hasn't seen another soul in weeks. The snow's falling harder. The river's frozen, the snares are empty, and something big is moving in the dark timber. If frostbite doesn't take his toes, salvation might. And up north, a black cowboy rides night guard alone, staring into the dark, waiting for movement that might not be a coyote. The frontier wasn't a myth. It wasn't a movie either. It was hard, fast, and wild. It was men and women shaping out lives on stolen land under a big sky too big for mercy. It was freedom at the barrel of a gun, justice by rope, and survival with no safety net. But what made the American frontier the wildest, most violent, lawless, unpredictable chapter in U.S. history? These 11 facts tell the story, one at a time. My name is Matt Francisco, and this is Wild America. Now, let's start with what made the West bleed first. Number 1, gunfights. Back then, guns weren't just for show, they were a way of life. The frontier didn't care much for laws, and most men knew it. If trouble came knocking, you didn't call for help, you reached for iron. Now, gunfights weren't daily, but they sure as hell happened more often than they do now. Today, most cops will go their whole career without ever firing a shot. But back then, a frontier lawman without blood on his revolver was either green or lucky. Also, shootouts weren't always the noble, high-noon duels you see in the movies. Most were fast, dirty, and brutal. Ambushes in back alleys, bullets fired from shadows, men dying before they even saw who pulled the trigger. And when the lead flew, it was often the end. No trauma centers, no ambulances, just a saloon floor or a dusty street, and a few last gasps of air. Gunfighters, outlaws, lawmen, they all lived with a target on their backs. Most didn't make it past 40. The ones who did were either quick, cruel, or both. And that's basically the truth of gunfights on the frontier. However, back then, gunfights weren't the only test of grit. Try 16 hours in the saddle. Number 2, the cowboys. Forget what Hollywood told you. Cowboys weren't all white, not even close. 1 in 4 cowboys was black. You see, after the Civil War, freedmen went west, looking for work, land, or freedom. Many already knew cattle, horses, and hard ranch work. They learned it under slavery, skills passed down from vaqueros, natives, and white ranchers. Vaqueros were the first cowboys, Spanish and Mexican riders who shaped the trade. Roping, branding, herding, it all came from them. Black cowboys did it all. Trail drives, night shifts, bronc busting, guarding cattle, cooking over open flames, same work, same risk, same hard miles. The only difference was they carried the weight of racism on their backs too. Cowboy crews were mixed, black, Mexican, native, white. They rode together, worked together, fought together. And that mix, the tension, it sparked fires. Different languages, cultures, tempers, all jammed into one camp. Fights broke out. Respect had to be earned, fast. The frontier was wild because everyone brought scars, and out there, one wrong move could mean blood. But what happened when the cowboys hit town? Number 3, lawless towns. One silver strike in 1879 turned a patch of desert into a boom town overnight. Miners rushed in. Then came gamblers, drifters, gunslingers, and working girls. Money flowed fast, but blood flowed faster. By 1880, Tombstone had 3,000 people and trouble on every street. Folks called it the town too tough to die, and they weren't joking. Actress Josephine Marcus, who'd marry Wyatt Earp, set it straight. Tombstone had a man for breakfast every morning. By 1880, the place was bursting, 8,000 strong. 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, brothels, dance halls, opium dens, it was all there. Law tried, vice won. The cowboys ran wild. Ike and Billy Clanton, the McLaurys, Billy Claiborne, rustlers, killers. They crossed the border with stolen stock and left chaos behind. Then the Earps arrived, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan. Badges, courage, and a taste for order. With them came Doc Holliday, sick, sharp, and deadly. Everything boiled over on October 26, 1881. The gunfight at the OK Corral. 30 seconds, dozens of shots, 3 men dead. Tom and Frank McLaury, Billy Clanton. But it didn't end there. Virgil was ambushed. Morgan was shot dead playing pool. Revenge followed fast. Tombstone was on fire. Even the culture had blood in its veins. The Birdcage Theater opened in 1882. It was part opera house, saloon, brothel, and casino. It ran non-stop for 8 years. In all its years, 26 people died inside. The New York Times called it the wildest, roughest, wickedest honky-tonk between Basin Street and the Barbary Coast. Well, they weren't wrong. But the wild didn't stop in Arizona. It exploded in the hills of the West. Number 4, Gold Rush Frenzy. It started with a spark of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848, and by 49, California was drowning in people chasing dreams of riches. They called them the 49ers. Miners, drifters, gamblers, grifters. Hundreds of thousands swarmed west, clawing for a piece of the promised fortune. And for a while, it paid. In just 1 year, $10 million worth of gold came out of the ground. By 1852, that number soared to over $80 million. But money brought madness. The mining camps were wild, lawless, and packed with desperate men. No women, no order, just whiskey, cards, and the sharp edge of greed. Fights broke out over claims, cards, and prostitutes. Guns settled arguments, knives ended others. If you struck gold, you became a target. If you didn't, you might just become a thief. As for justice, there was none. Courts didn't exist, and sheriffs were rare. Miners made their own rules, but rules meant nothing when bullets do the talking. Furthermore, claim jumping was common. So were revenge killings. Vigilantes filled the void. Lynch mobs formed fast with rope and rage. San Francisco turned sour. Disappointed miners formed gangs. The streets knew murder, theft, and blood. And behind the gold rush glimmer, a darker truth settled in. White settlers waged a quiet war against anyone who didn't look like them. California natives were hunted like animals, slaughtered with impunity. Chinese migrants were taxed more, barred from courtrooms, and beaten in the streets. Black Americans and native people had no legal voice. If something was done to them, it stayed done. And while some struck gold, others lost everything, starting with their land. Number 5. Native American conflicts. Long, brutal wars occurred between the U.S. and native tribes who'd lived on that land for thousands of years. The fighting started back in the 1600s. British, French, Spanish, all chasing land. Different flags, same goal: push the tribes out. Sometimes tribes took sides, sometimes they stood alone. Either way, land lost, people killed, promises broken. After the American Revolution, the U.S. kept pushing. By 1786, they were building reservations, calling tribes nations, just words to make land grabs sound official. Then came the War of 1812. Tribes rose up in the Midwest and South, and they fell. Treaties followed, deals made under pressure, broken fast, land gone again. In 1821, President Monroe said natives deserved justice, even as his government cleared them out north of the Ohio River. Then came the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that's when the real dying began. Forced marches west, cold, hunger, sickness. The Cherokee fought in court and won. Didn't matter. In 1838, U.S. troops rounded them up. Some were beaten, some shot, the rest were marched 1,000 miles with nothing. 4,000 died. And that was the Trail of Tears. Then in 1864, it happened again. 8,000 Navajo were driven from their homeland, 350 miles through the desert. They called it the Long Walk. Starvation and disease killed nearly half. Some tribes fought back, won a few battles, vanished into the hills, but supplies ran thin and the U.S. kept coming. The frontier was wild, no doubt. It was a war zone, and for native tribes, the war never really ended. And while one kind of fight was about survival, the next was about reputation. Number 6. Outlaw legends. You see, in addition to hard men, the frontier also bred legends. Outlaws carving their names into the land, robbing trains, stealing horses, rustling cattle, shooting men in broad daylight. No mercy, no second thoughts. Stories stuck. Newspapers turned them mythic, half hero, half nightmare. Dime novels spread their names like wildfire. Hollywood later gave them charm, but back then, they were cold-blooded. Some fought for lost causes, most just wanted money. The West in particular was chaotic. Immigrants pouring in, tribes already there, farmers scraping by, steam engines roaring, gas lamps flashing, one foot in the future, the other stuck in mud and blood. Take Jesse James, for example. Born 1847, Missouri, raised in Confederate country. His family owned slaves. His loyalties ran deep. He rose with bushwhackers during the war, guerrillas who took no prisoners. Afterward, he didn't stop. He formed the James Younger Gang. They robbed trains, hit banks, killed without cause. Some called him a rebel folk hero, said he was like Robin Hood. Truth be told, he kept the loot. He fed his own. John Newman Edwards, a pro-Confederate writer, made Jesse a symbol, spun his crimes into rebellion. Jesse played along, wrote letters, called himself bold, compared himself to Napoleon and Alexander. Yet by 1881, Missouri's governor had enough. He offered 10 grand for Jesse or his brother Frank, dead or alive. Then came quiet. On April 3rd, 1882, Jesse was standing on a chair fixing a crooked picture frame. Behind him, Robert Ford, a gang member, a man he trusted, pulled a gun, shot Jesse in the back of the head, killed him on the spot. Ford was found guilty, then pardoned. Yet, if you think Jesse James was the end of it, think again. We got something special coming. A one-of-a-kind dive into the 10 most notorious gunslingers of the Old West. Killers, legends, and ghosts with itchy trigger fingers. Don't miss it on our channel. But the frontier didn't stay wild forever. By 1900, trains ran on time. Telegraph wires crossed the land. Lawmen got faster. Courts got harsher. As for outlaws, they either died bloody or disappeared into legend. But let's talk about what happened when wild towns finally said enough. Number 7. Vigilante justice. You see, out on the frontier, law came late, if it came at all. No sheriff, no judge, just folks with rifles and rope, handling things themselves. And when crimes piled up, settlers formed vigilante groups. Justice was fast, rough, and didn't wait on a courtroom. Take Ogle County, Illinois. A gang called the Banditti robbed and killed, then withdrew into the woods. Locals had enough. They formed the Regulators. When their leader, John Campbell, was murdered, they struck back, tracked the killers and hanged them. No trial, just a tree. Montana saw the same. In the 1860s, vigilante committees handled crime their own way. If a man was caught stealing, or worse, they'd hang him. Publicly, quickly, no lawyer, no appeal. For a time it worked. Word got around. Criminals cleared out. Towns quieted. But by the 1800s, with real lawmen arriving, those same vigilantes started looking more like mobs. And when it comes to lynching, most think of the South. But out west, it was just as brutal. In California, between 1848 and 1860, dozens were lynched, mostly Mexican Americans and other minorities. And it got worse. From the end of the Civil War to World War II, over 4,400 black Americans were lynched across the U.S. The Equal Justice Initiative calls it what it was, racial terror. Even in North Dakota, violence ran deep. In the late 1800s, a gang called the Stranglers lynched around 60 rustlers near the Little Missouri River. No courts, no warnings. So, yeah, in the frontier, justice didn't always wear a badge. But even justice couldn't keep the trails safe. Number 8, stagecoach robberies. Out on the trail, the stagecoach ruled. Wood wheels, leather reins, and a sweating team pulled settlers, drifters, mail, and money. Wood wheels, leather reins, and a sweating team pulled settlers, drifters, mail, and money into the wild. Gold, silver, payroll, all packed in with folks just chasing a new start. But bandits were watching. As gold fever spread, stagecoaches became targets. In Arizona alone, over 130 holdups hit between 1875 and 1903. Some outlaws struck 2 coaches at once. Over 200 robbers made a living off stages there. Most got away. The law only ever ID'd 80, 79 men and 1 woman. Pearl Hart, the girl bandit. In 1898, she pulled one of the West's last big jobs. Tombstone and the Black Canyon route were hard hit, but forget the movie scenes. Only 3 Arizona holdups had riders chasing down coaches at full gallop. Most robbers waited on foot, hiding near steep cliffs or river crossings. When the coach slowed, they stepped out, guns up, and got to work. One man made a name for it, Black Bart. He hit stagecoaches across California and Oregon in the 1870s and 80s. Always polite, never swore. He left poems behind like signatures, and he was never caught in the act. But the Pinkertons finally got him, and eventually, stage lines fought back. Guards rode shotgun, wagons got armor. In 1878, one company rolled out the Monitor, a steel-plated beast meant to scare off thieves. Between the 1850s and the early 1900s, over 450 stagecoach robberies were recorded. Still, the coaches rolled on, dust flying, dangers always close. Then the railroad came. By 1869, trains moved faster, safer, and tougher to rob. The Deadwood stage ran its last trip in 1890. Soon came cars, roads changed, the old coach faded. But for a few wild decades, it was the frontier's lifeline, and a target for anyone bold enough to shout, "Throw down the box." But you know, before the roads, before the trails, came the scouts and trappers, the ghosts in the trees. Number 9, era of the mountain man. They came before the railroads, before the towns, before the law. From the early 1800s to the mid-1800s, mountain men and fur trappers ventured deep into the unknown. No roads, no backup, just untamed land, hostile skies, and whatever they could carry on their backs. These men were pure survivors, forging paths through some of the roughest terrain in North America. They lived far from any settlement, tucked into high mountain valleys and thick forests. Summers scorched, winters cut to the bone. If they couldn't trap, they starved. If they couldn't shoot straight, they died. There were no stores, no doctors. They made their own clothes, patched their own gear, and built their own shelters from whatever they could find. Grizzlies, wolves, and mountain lions stalked the woods. Trappers didn't always win those fights. Hugh Glass, one of the toughest of them all, was mauled nearly to death by a grizzly. Left for dead, crawled for miles to survive. His story is still told. but because it wasn't. Got the full scoop on him as well, so don't forget to check out the full episode on our channel. But yeah, out in that lawless country, mountain men also crossed paths with native tribes, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, sometimes living side by side. For instance, James Beckworth, born a black man in Virginia, became a war chief in the Crow Nation. Others weren't so lucky. Some walked into ambushes. The fur trade paid well if you made it back alive. Beaver pelts were gold back then, but the business was cutthroat. Rival trappers, company men from outfits like the Hudson's Bay or the American Fur Company, all scrapping for the same pelts. However, greed led to overtrapping. The beavers eventually vanished. So did the money. But the land itself was a test. Steep cliffs, dense forests, endless plains, no maps. Just memory, instinct, and luck. And when someone found a safe pass, like South Pass in Wyoming, word spread fast. That route would later open the way for settlers heading west. As for the mountain men, some of them turned guides for wagon trains, others drifted, broke and forgotten. And if this taste of frontier grit has you curious, we got hours of the real nasty stuff. Freezing nights, busted traps, lost hunters, all of it. Check out the wilderness episodes when you got the time. Meanwhile, when land started filling up, freedom clashed with ownership, and rifles did the talking. Number 10, range wars. You see, out in the open range, blood ran deep, sometimes deeper than water. Range wars weren't quick shootouts. They were long, bitter feuds. Cattlemen versus settlers, cowboys versus homesteaders. The land was wide, but never wide enough. Cattle ranchers needed room to run herds, and so fences went up, tempers snapped, and the rifles came out. One of the worst was the Johnson County War in Wyoming, late 1800s into the 90s. Big cattle companies ran the land and wanted it all, grass, water, everything. And when small settlers moved in, the barons fought back hard. They hired killers, sent them to scare, burn, and kill. But the settlers didn't fold. They raised a 200-man posse, faced them head on. The U.S. cavalry had to step in before the county burned. Around 10 men died, maybe more. Depends on who's telling it. Even after that, things didn't cool off. The war just went quiet, but it never really ended. Then came the Pleasant Valley War in Arizona. Now, this one was cattlemen versus sheepmen, two families locked in a blood feud over grazing land. It started in the 1880s, ended in slaughter. Up to 50 men killed, some families wiped clean. No trials, no mercy, just revenge. Arizona got a taste for blood it couldn't wash off. Some said it even slowed down statehood. As for the law, barely there. Vague, broken, or just ignored. You see, out here on the frontier, a man protected what he had or lost it. The sheriff might be a day's ride away, or dead. So folks settled things their own way, with fire, with bullets, whatever it took. But not all who went west were hunters or gunslingers. Some just wanted a new life, and paid in blood to get it. Number 11, the Emigrant Trails. They came chasing promise, land, gold, a fresh start. But the Oregon and California trails didn't give anything easy. Over 2,000 miles of rough, wild country stood between the Missouri River and the western frontier. Every step forward came with risk, and many never made it through. The trail didn't kill quickly at first. It wore folks down. But disease hit fast. Cholera was the worst. One minute you were walking, the next you were gone, dead by sundown. Dysentery, typhoid, scurvy, they followed close behind. They called the Oregon Trail the nation's longest graveyard for a reason. Some say 1 in 10 didn't make it. But it wasn't just sickness. Rivers killed plenty, swollen, fast, and cold. They swallowed wagons whole. Animals panicked mid-crossing. Oxen bucked, wheels snapped, people drowned. The Oregon Trail Center said river crossings were the most dangerous things pioneers ever did, and they had to do it over and over. Then there were accidents, everyday ones. A gun misfires, a wheel crushes a leg, a horse kicks. Most folks had no clue how to handle livestock, wagons, or firearms. One slip and that was it. No doctor, no help. The weather didn't care either. Plains heat scorched travelers dry, while mountain snowstorms hit like a trap. And in the high Sierra, the snow stopped you cold. The Donner Party learned that the hard way in '46. They got stuck. They ran out of food, and when hunger turned brutal, they turned on each other. And the land itself, it never gave an inch. You crossed deserts when your tongue stuck to your teeth. You climbed mountains where the wind cut like knives. The Great Basin was dust and silence. The Sierra Nevada was stone and snow. There was no smooth road, just juts, rocks, and wrong turns. Bad planning got people killed too. Run out of food, you starved. Lose your gear on a river, same thing. Hunting helped if you were lucky, but most weren't. Some ended up eating roots, leather, or worse. Scurvy showed up when fresh food ran out, teeth fell out, skin bruised easy, you wasted away. Loneliness was another killer. Not the fast kind, but slow, creeping. Isolated families walked for months with no company but their own thoughts. The monotony, the fear, the never-ending stretch of trail, it broke some. People snapped. Some wandered off. A few didn't come back. As for attacks, most native tribes traded peacefully, but tensions ignited when land, game, or pride got crossed. Fights broke out, sometimes bloody, and don't forget the lies. Folks followed guidebooks full of bad advice, like the Hastings Cutoff, billed as a shortcut, but it dragged the Donner Party straight into a nightmare. One wrong turn and you'd be out there alone, lost, and running out of time. But we barely scratched the surface here. For the full story on the Oregon and California trails, every river crossed, every grave dug, we got full-length episodes waiting for you on our channel. But, yeah, the West, the frontier, it was never tamed. It just ran out of land.